Welcome back to my channel, where we uncover the forgotten corners of the past. Today, I'm taking you into a story about the haunting disappearance of two children in 1991 and how their church hymnals, found 32 years later, finally broke the silence that you might have never heard before. A mystery buried in the dust of time, a truth that will send shivers down your spine. But before we embark on this journey, take a moment to let me know, where are you listening to this story from? That helps me understand how far these secrets have traveled. And if this story truly captivates you, if it makes you ponder, don't hesitate to give me a like and subscribe to the channel to keep me going. Together, we'll explore the darkest pages of history, and you won't want to miss a thing. The story of a tragedy is often read backward, from the grim discovery to the final, frantic moments, tracing a path of sorrow back to its source. But the cruelest stories, the ones that etch themselves into the soul of a place and haunt its collective memory for generations, begin not with a scream, but with a whisper of absolute normalcy. They begin on mornings like October 13th, 1991, in the small, heartland town of Cedar Falls, Iowa. The day dawned as a masterpiece of autumn, a crisp, clean air carrying the faint, sweet scent of wood smoke and damp earth, swept through streets lined with majestic maple trees, their leaves, in a final, defiant blaze of glory, had turned brilliant shades of amber, gold, and deep crimson. They rustled gently in the breeze, a sound like soft applause for the turning of the season. Inside the Parker home at 215 Elm Street, the quiet hum of a Sunday morning was underway. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the last traces of bacon from breakfast, and the rhythmic ticking of the kitchen clock marked the peaceful passage of time. It was against this idyllic backdrop that 8-year-old Jessica Parker, her hand holding the smaller, trusting one of her 6-year-old brother, Tommy, began a walk they had taken 100 times before. Jessica, ever the responsible older sister, meticulously adjusted the collar of her navy blue Sunday dress, a determined look of concentration on her young face. Tommy, his pockets likely already filled with interesting rocks and a single, perfect acorn from the front yard, walked beside her with the boundless, unexamined trust that only a child can possess. He tugged on her hand, pointing out a fat squirrel scurrying up an oak tree, his laughter a bright, fleeting sound in the cool air. Their destination was St. Matthew's Lutheran Church, a mere 4 blocks away. Their mother, Linda, watched them from the kitchen window, a soft smile on her lips. She had sent them ahead for the children's choir practice, a Sunday morning ritual as ingrained in their lives as family dinner. The route was a map etched into Jessica's memory, a geography of safety and familiarity past the Hendersons' pristine white picket fence, where their dog, Buddy, would often bark a friendly hello. Around the corner were old Mr. Kowalski, a fixture of the neighborhood as predictable as the sunrise, always sat on his porch reading the paper, nodding silently as they passed, and then straight down Church Street until the steeple, a familiar, guiding finger pointing toward the heavens, came into view. It was a journey that should have taken no more than 8 minutes, an insignificant slice of time on a peaceful Sunday morning, a brief moment of independence for 2 growing children, but in the silent, unblinking calculus of fate, that 8-minute walk would stretch into an agonizing void of 32 years. The Parker children were supposed to arrive at the church doors by 9:43 a.m. They never did. They didn't run away. They didn't cause a scene. They simply ceased to be present. They vanished from the face of the earth on a sun-drenched street, in a town that believed itself to be a sanctuary, shielded from the evils of the outside world. How does this happen? How do two children, vibrant and full of life, evaporate into the crisp October air? To understand the depth of this impossibility, to grasp the sheer brutal efficiency of their disappearance, one must first understand the town of Cedar Falls itself. In 1991, Cedar Falls was more than just a location on a map of Iowa. It was an embodiment of the American dream, a tapestry woven from the threads of faith, family, and hard, honest work. It was a place built on a foundation of shared trust, a community where front doors were often left unlocked during the day and neighbors were considered extended family, ready to lend a cup of sugar or watch over a child at a moment's notice. This was a world where the greatest dangers seemed to belong to the sprawling, anonymous cities seen on the evening news, a distant, televised reality, not something that could ever touch them here, not in the quiet, God-fearing heart of America. The town's sense of security, built over generations of peaceful, predictable life, was as tangible and fertile as the black soil that surrounded it. But even in the most peaceful of landscapes, shadows can gather unnoticed, lengthening slowly until they consume everything. In the months leading up to that October, faint, unsettling whispers had begun to circulate among parents, though they were never loud enough to coalesce into a single, unified alarm. Hindsight, of course, a cruel and unforgiving lens, would later cast these isolated incidents in a far more sinister light. Several parents from the local park had reported a man, his features always frustratingly nondescript, approaching their children, offering candy or asking for help finding a lost puppy. The oldest, most chilling lines in a predator's script. The story of 9-year-old Amanda Foster was perhaps the most unnerving. Walking home from school, she felt a prickling sensation on the back of her neck. The undeniable feeling of being watched. She glanced over her shoulder and saw a man in a simple baseball cap, keeping a steady distance behind her. She quickened her pace, her heart beginning to hammer against her ribs. He matched her pace. For 3 terrifying blocks, he was her shadow. Silent and persistent. Only when she scrambled up the steps of her own front porch and fumbled for the doorknob did he finally turn and walk away, melting back into the placid scenery of the neighborhood. More concretely, some residents, including a neighbor of the Parkers, had noted the intermittent presence of an unfamiliar, dark-colored van. It was a ghost, appearing and disappearing without a clear pattern. It would be parked for hours at various locations, a silent, brooding observer with a single, unseen occupant. At the time, these were disparate, minor anomalies, easily rationalized away. A lost driver, a private investigator on some mundane case, a salesman, in a town built on the principle of assuming the best in people. These events were like ripples on a pond, quickly vanishing, leaving the placid surface undisturbed. No one could have known they were portents, the quiet, methodical groundwork being laid for a crime that would shatter the town's very soul. The community's greatest strength, its profound, unquestioning trust, was also its most terrifying, fatal vulnerability. And at the heart of this trusting world was a family like any other. Their lives a gentle, predictable rhythm of work, school, and faith. Linda Parker was a mother whose world revolved around the orbits of her 2 children. On that final, ordinary morning, as she finished washing the breakfast dishes, the warm water soothing on her hands, she was humming the melody of Amazing Grace. It was the same hymn Jessica had been practicing with such enthusiasm all week, her small, clear voice filling the house. Linda's husband, David, a dedicated worker at the massive John Deere factory that was the town's industrial heart, was asleep upstairs, resting after a long and grueling night shift. Their home was a haven of simple love and routine, a small, perfect world about to be irrevocably, violently broken. The first tremor of the earthquake that would destroy their lives was the shrill, piercing ring of the telephone, the key figure tasked with navigating this unfolding nightmare, and the man who would carry its weight for the rest of his career was Detective Ray Morrison of the Cedar Falls Police Department, a 20-year veteran. Morrison was a man of quiet competence, his demeanor shaped by years of dealing with the darker, more sordid aspects of human nature. He had handled missing person cases before. They were often frantic, messy affairs that usually resolved within hours. A child lost in the woods after chasing a rabbit. A teenager running away from home in a fit of pique. But from the moment he received the call at his desk, interrupting a mountain of paperwork, Morrison felt a cold knot tighten in his gut. The dispatcher's voice was strained, lacking the usual professional calm. This was different. As he drove his unmarked sedan through the quiet Sunday streets towards St. Matthew's, he observed a town still wrapped in its weekend tranquility. Families were heading to church. The scent of roasting meat was beginning to drift from open windows, and kids were riding bikes on the sidewalks. The world was still turning as it should, yet he was driving toward a tear in that fabric, a localized rip in reality. When he arrived at the church, the sanctuary that should have been filling with song had become a makeshift command center, buzzing with a tense, fearful energy. What immediately struck Detective Morrison as profoundly disturbing was not what he found, but what he did not. There was no evidence, no discarded piece of clothing, no scuff marks on the pavement, no credible witnesses who saw anything remotely unusual. Just Mrs. Henderson, her face pale with worry, who confirmed seeing the children pass by as they always did, chatting happily, she'd said, her voice trembling. The trail, followed by the best tracking dogs the fire department had, simply ended, abruptly, inexplicably, at the corner of Church Street and Maple Avenue, a mere 2 blocks from the safety of St. Matthew's. The scent vanished completely. The dogs grew confused, whining and circling the same spot before giving up, their handlers looking on in disbelief. It was as if the children had been lifted from the pavement by an invisible hand, leaving behind a perfect, chilling vacuum. This absolute absence of clues was the first great, abnormal sign, a testament not to a crime of passion or opportunity, but to a terrifying level of planning and cold, calculated precision. The disappearance of Jessica and Tommy Parker was not an accident. It was an act of meticulous, predatory execution for Detective Morrison, staring at a map of a 4-block route that had suddenly become an abyss. The case was already becoming more than a job. It was an affront to logic, a personal offense against the natural order of the world he had sworn to protect. The nightmare had just begun. The silence that followed Linda Parker's call to the church was not empty. It was a dense, heavy presence, a physical entity that sucked all the air from her lungs and leashed all the strength from her limbs. Her hand, slick with a sudden, cold sweat, trembled as she gripped the plastic receiver. The words from Dorothy Matthews, the Reverend's wife, spoken with a gentle, rising tide of concern, echoed in the hollow chamber of her mind. "We haven't seen them yet, dear." Every maternal instinct, every primal fear sensor hardwired into her being, shrieked in a silent, deafening unison. This was not a case of children dawdling to examine a fallen leaf. This was a fundamental tear in the fabric of the universe, a violation of natural law. Within moments, she was out the door, the half-prepared potato salad for the church potluck forgotten on the kitchen counter, a pathetic, mundane relic of a morning that no longer existed. Her run down Elm Street was a frantic, breathless prayer. each ragged gasp forming her children's names. The beautiful autumn morning had transformed into a menacing, surreal tableau. The cheerful colors of the changing leaves now seemed to mock her growing panic, their vibrant reds and oranges like the flickering flames of an unfolding hell. She retraced her children's familiar route, but the street felt alien, its landmarks twisted into something sinister. She pounded on every door along the way, her calls of Jessica Tommy growing more ragged, more desperate with each silent house that greeted her. The world began to shrink, constricting to the frantic, hammering rhythm of her own heartbeat and the terrifying, profound absence of her children's voices. By 11:00 a.m., the alarm had spread through the town's nervous system like a jolt of electricity. Reverend Matthews, his face a mask of grave concern, made the unprecedented decision to cancel the Sunday service. The sanctuary, a space designed for hymns of praise and prayers of peace, instead became a makeshift command center, the air thick with the murmur of anxious voices and the sharp, urgent crackle of police radios. The initial, frantic search by a lone, panicked mother had swelled into a full-blown mobilization of the community. Half the congregation, still in their Sunday best, fanned out across the neighborhood, their faith now expressed not in prayer, but in a desperate, methodical grid search. The church ladies, their faces grim, quickly organized to make sandwiches and coffee for the burgeoning volunteer force, their practical actions a bulwark against the rising tide of fear. Meanwhile, back at 215 Elm Street, David Parker woke up to a world turned inside out. As a man who worked the grueling night shift at the John Deere factory, his sleep was a precious commodity, a hard-earned reprieve from the roar of machinery. He woke to an unnaturally quiet house, the usual sounds of his children's Sunday morning cartoon-fueled chatter conspicuously absent. He walked downstairs, expecting to find them on the living room floor, and instead found a home gripped by an eerie stillness. The sight of the abandoned preparations for the potluck and the phone left off the hook sent the first icy tendril of fear coiling in his stomach. A moment later, a neighbor, her face etched with a pity he didn't yet understand, delivered the news in a hushed, trembling voice. David's world, built on the solid bedrock of hard work and family, did not just crack, it completely shattered. The bone-deep fatigue from his long night was instantly incinerated by a surge of pure, unadulterated adrenaline and terror. He joined the search, a man moving through a nightmare, his mind a chaotic whirl, unable to process how the world he had left just 8 hours before had been replaced by this waking horror. As the afternoon wore on and the Iowa State Police were contacted, the investigation formalized. But the first leads that emerged were nothing more than flickering ghosts, cruel whispers that offered a torturous glimmer of hope before dissolving into nothing. A gas station attendant 20 miles away reported seeing 2 children matching the description getting into a blue sedan with out-of-state plates. The lead was pursued with methodical determination, consuming precious hours and manpower. But it led to a dead end, a family on vacation whose children bore a passing superficial resemblance. A farmer to the south claimed to have heard children's voices crying for help near his property. But a thorough search of the woods and fields by the high school football team yielded only the rustling of the wind through the dry corn stubble. Each lead was a small, cruel drama of its own, a vicious cycle of hope and despair that left the family and investigators emotionally wrung out and increasingly desperate. The first week passed in a blur of search parties, media interviews, and sleepless, agonizing nights. The smiling faces of Jessica and Tommy, captured in their school photos, were now everywhere. They stared out from flyers stapled to every telephone pole and taped to every storefront window in Cedar Falls. their innocent gazes a constant, silent accusation. The local newspaper, the Cedar Falls Gazette, ran the story on a front page every single day. Each headline a fresh stab of pain for the family. Soon, the local tragedy metastasized into a statewide obsession, and then a national spectacle. Television crews from Des Moines and even Chicago descended upon the small town, the satellite trucks lining the quiet residential streets like invading monoliths. The Parker family's private, intimate grief was now public property, a commodity to be packaged and broadcast across the nation. This relentless media exposure was a double-edged sword. It brought an unprecedented level of resources and awareness to the search. But it also placed the Parker family under an incredible, soul-crushing pressure. Special Agent Rebecca Santos from the FBI's Child Abduction Rapid Deployment Team arrived from Des Moines, bringing with her a new level of clinical intensity and federal authority. There was a subtle but palpable friction between her team's by-the-book, data-driven approach and Detective Morrison's instinct-based knowledge of his own town. While they cooperated, an undercurrent of tension remained. Linda was interviewed for hours on end, forced to excavate every memory, every detail of her children's lives, their friends, their habits, their secret hiding places, their fears. Each question, however necessary, felt like an accusation, a suggestion that she had somehow failed to protect them, that some detail of their ordinary lives held the key to this extraordinary horror. The psychological toll on the family was devastating. Linda stopped eating regularly. The very thought of food was a nauseating reminder of the family meals she might never share again. She lost 15 pounds in the first month, her frame becoming frail. Her eyes sunk deep in the dark shadows of a grief that never slept. David took an indefinite leave from his job, unable to concentrate on anything but the all-consuming need to find his children. The once solid and loving foundation of their marriage began to strain and crack under the incredible, unspoken pressure. They moved through their home like ghosts, the silence between them filled with a shared sorrow so heavy it was impossible to voice. They would sit in the living room for hours, the empty space on the sofa where their children should have been feeling like a physical presence. A black hole that absorbed all light and warmth. As the case attracted national attention, the Parkers were urged to appear on several television talk shows, a deeply surreal and painful experience. They sat under the hot, unforgiving studio lights, their faces pale and drawn, pleading with the vast, unseen audience of millions for any information. A reward fund, started by the congregation at St. Matthew's, had grown to over $50,000 thanks to donations from across the country. But the money felt meaningless, a hollow symbol in the face of their profound, irreplaceable loss. Despite the massive media coverage, the unprecedented search effort, and the prayers of a nation, Jessica and Tommy Parker seemed to have been erased from existence as cleanly as if they had never been born. For 20 years, the silence that followed was absolute and profound. The seasons turned. The yellow ribbons that had once adorned the trees throughout Cedar Falls faded and tore in the harsh Iowa winters, eventually disappearing altogether, like the hope they represented. The case went cold, officially relegated to the dusty shelves of the police department's archives, a thick, grim testament to a community's greatest failure and a family's unending nightmare. Other cases came and went. The world moved on, adopting new technologies, fighting new wars, forgetting old sorrows. But for the Parker family, and for Captain Ray Morrison, who kept the case file on a corner of his desk, no matter his rank, time did not heal the wound. It only deepened it, turning it into a chronic, aching void. Then, in 2011, 2 decades after the Parker children walked into oblivion, an unexpected phone call to the Cedar Falls Police Department would reignite the investigation with the force of a lightning strike. The call did not come from a tip line or a deathbed confession. It came from Dr. Patricia Walsh, an archaeologist from the University of Iowa. Her team was conducting a routine historical preservation survey at the site of an old derelict railway depot on the outskirts of town, a place of urban decay and forgotten history. Its windows boarded up, its walls covered in faded graffiti. The depot, abandoned since the 1960s, was slated for demolition to make way for new commercial development. It was a purely academic exercise in documenting the past before it was paved over and forgotten forever, Dr. Walsh explained, her voice a mixture of academic excitement and something else, something more hesitant and disturbed. That her team, while mapping the building's crumbling foundation, had discovered a structural anomaly. It was a makeshift wall in the basement, constructed with a skill and care that was jarringly out of place amidst the surrounding decay. Behind that wall, they found what appeared to be a hidden shelter, a space that was not on any of the original blueprints. And inside, they had discovered personal items that appeared to belong to children, including clothing and toys that could, according to their initial assessment, date back to the early 1990s. Within hours, the site was swarmed by law enforcement, the quiet, academic excavation transforming into a major, modern crime scene. The air buzzed with an energy the case hadn't seen in 20 years. Ray Morrison, now a captain, gray-haired and just a few years from a retirement he had never looked forward to, was granted special permission to participate. For him, this was not just a breakthrough. It was a ghost from his past roaring back to life, demanding a final reckoning, working under the harsh, sterile glare of portable floodlights that cut through the gloom of the depot's basement. Forensic archaeologists and crime scene specialists began a methodical examination of the hidden room. The space was an elaborate, disturbing creation. A cleverly concealed entrance led to a crude but functional living area, complete with sleeping pallets made of old blankets, shelves stocked with canned goods, and even a small, primitive ventilation system connected to the building's original air shafts. It was a predator's nest, but it was the personal effects, unearthed with the delicate precision of brushes and tweezers, that caused the air to grow thick with a dreadful certainty. They found children's clothing, folded neatly, in sizes that could have fit Jessica and Tommy. They found worn books and small, simple toys, tragically out of place in such a grim setting. And then they found the item that served as a direct, heartbreaking link across 20 years of silence. It was a small, wooden cross, crudely carved, identical to the ones given to children in the St. Matthew's Sunday School program. The discovery of this hidden chamber was a bombshell. It was the great, horrifying revelation that shifted the entire narrative of the case. The Parker children hadn't just been taken. They had been brought here, to this subterranean tomb of secrets, for the first time in 2 decades. The investigation had a location, a crime scene, and now the dead could finally begin to speak. The discovery of the hidden room beneath the old railway depot was not an end, but a beginning. For 2 decades, the investigation into the disappearance of Jessica and Tommy Parker had been a ghost story, a narrative built on absence and speculation. Now, for the first time, it had a physical epicenter, a crime scene. And as forensic teams in sterile white suits descended into that dusty subterranean space, it felt as though the dead could finally begin to speak. The air in the chamber was cold and stale, heavy with the scent of damp earth, decay, and the profound weight of forgotten time. Every surface was meticulously processed for fingerprints, every fiber of cloth carefully collected, every speck of organic material treated as a potential witness from a silent past. The most significant advantage the 2011 investigation possessed was time itself. The advancements in forensic science since 1991 were monumental. DNA analysis, a technology in its infancy back then, was now a powerful tool capable of extracting stories from the faintest of biological traces. Samples were taken from every corner of the room, from the crude sleeping pallets to the discarded food containers, each one holding the potential for a genetic ghost, a definitive link to the room's occupant or its long-lost victims. But while the science was modern, the most damning piece of evidence was decidedly analog, tucked away inside a rotting wooden crate beneath a pile of yellowed newspapers. Investigators found a simple spiral-bound notebook. Its cover was plain, its pages brittle with age. It was a mundane object that contained an encyclopedic chronicle of pure evil. The writing inside was not a straightforward diary. It was a meticulous, chillingly organized collection of notes and sketches, written partially in a complex, private cipher. This was not the work of a disorganized mind, but of a cunning, paranoid, and terrifyingly patient predator. The notebook was immediately sent to the FBI's elite cryptanalysis and racketeering records unit in Quantico, Virginia, for weeks. The nation's best codebreakers worked to unravel the secrets locked within its pages. When they finally broke the code, what emerged was a document of pure, unadulterated horror. The decoded messages revealed the disturbing thoughts and methodical plans of someone who had been observing and tracking children in Cedar Falls and surrounding communities for years. The entries were written in a cold, detached, almost scientific prose that was utterly devoid of human emotion. They included detailed descriptions of children's daily routines, the schools they attended, and their family schedules. It was a predator's field guide. The most chilling entry, the one that caused a wave of physical sickness to wash over even the most hardened investigators, was dated October 10th, 1991, just 3 days before the children's disappearance. It read, "Subjects J&T, Sunday morning routine confirmed, route to location predictable, unaccompanied, optimal time window available." Jessica and Tommy had been reduced to initials. Their vibrant lives and routines distilled into a tactical problem to be solved. The journal also contained references to other children from other small towns across Iowa and neighboring states during the 1980s and early 1990s. As investigators cross-referenced these cryptic entries with old cold case files, a horrifying pattern began to emerge. At least 7 other children from rural communities had vanished under similar circumstances during this period. All were between the ages of 6 and 10. All had disappeared while traveling short distances alone or with siblings. None of the cases had ever been solved. The Parker case was not an isolated tragedy. It was a single, terrible chapter in the long, silent reign of a serial predator. The journal was the irrefutable evidence that connected it all. It was the monster's own confession, written in a language of his own making. The journal provided the what, the how, and the horrifying how many, but it did not yet provide the who. The breakthrough on that front would come not from a forensic lab, but from the dogged, methodical work of an investigative reporter. In 2023, as the 32nd anniversary of the disappearance approached, Michael Chen from the Des Moines Register began working on a comprehensive feature story about the case. He spent months poring over old, archaic property records for the depot, a tedious task that had been overlooked in the initial chaos of the 2011 discovery. And in those dusty ledgers, he found a name, Frank Kowalski. He had been employed sporadically as a caretaker and security person for several abandoned properties in the Cedar Falls area during the late 80s and early 90s, including the old depot. The name struck Chen as familiar, cross-referencing his interview notes. He made the electrifying connection that sent a jolt through the entire investigation. The Kowalski family had lived on Elm Street. Old Mr. Kowalski was the man who sat on his porch reading the newspaper. a landmark of safety on the children's route to church. Frank was his son, a man who had struggled with employment, had a history of minor legal troubles, and, most significantly, had abruptly left Cedar Falls in November 1991, just weeks after Jessica and Tommy vanished. The monster had not been a faceless stranger. He had been a neighbor. A nationwide search was immediately launched. Modern database searches and digital forensics, tools unimaginable in 1991, eventually traced a man living under a slightly modified name to a desolate, rundown trailer park in Northern California. When authorities located Frank Kowalski in early 2024, they found a man who was a mere shadow of whatever he had once been. Now, in his 60s, he was frail, emaciated, and suffering from advanced emphysema, tethered by a clear plastic tube to a noisy oxygen tank. When confronted with questions about Cedar Falls, he initially denied everything, his voice a hoarse, dismissive rasp, but when presented with a copy of the coded journal and a forensic handwriting analysis that definitively matched his script, his demeanor changed. The facade, maintained for over 30 years of a transient, hidden life, crumbled under the weight of the irrefutable proof. Over the course of several interviews, conducted with medical supervision due to his deteriorating health, Kowalski began to talk. He confirmed that he had been living intermittently in the hidden room, using it as his base of operations. He had watched the Parker children for months, learning their routine, their perfect, clockwork predictability. He recounted the events of October 13th, 1991 with a chilling, detached calm. He had approached them, he said, telling them he was a friend of their father, that their mother had been suddenly taken ill and he was asked to drive them to the church. Jessica and Tommy, trusting and well-mannered as they had been raised to be, had believed him. What followed was the final, dark unveiling of every parent's worst nightmare. He held the children at the depot for several days while the massive search effort was underway just miles away. He claimed he had intended to release them, but as the investigation intensified and the media coverage spread nationwide, he became increasingly paranoid. The most heartbreaking revelation came when Kowalski admitted that both children had died within a week of their abduction. It was not, he claimed, an act of intentional violence. It was an act of profound, monstrous neglect. He had been unprepared for the logistics of keeping two young children alive in the poorly heated and ventilated basement room. Fearing capture for what was now a double murder, he had disposed of their bodies in a panic and fled. When pressed for the location where Jessica and Tommy had been buried, his answers became vague, inconsistent. He claimed to have buried them somewhere in the woods outside Cedar Falls. But his memory was either genuinely impaired by decades of alcohol abuse, or he was withholding one final, cruel piece of information. 3 weeks after his confession, before he could be transported back to Iowa to be formally charged, Frank Kowalski died in custody, succumbing to complications from his respiratory illness. His death meant that justice, in a legal sense, would never be fully served. There would be no trial, no day in court for the Parker family, no public reckoning where he would be forced to answer for his crimes. He had escaped the judgment of man, leaving behind a confession that answered the question of what had happened, but also a new, agonizing set of questions about the children's final days and, most painfully, the location of their remains. The news of Kowalski's confession and subsequent death sent shockwaves through Cedar Falls. The revelation was not a moment of triumphant closure, but one of profound, sickening horror. The monster had a name, and it was a name they knew. He was not a boogeyman from some faraway place. He was the son of the quiet old man on the corner. The knowledge turned nostalgic memories into scenes of a horror film, poisoning the town's collective memory of its own past. Every friendly wave, every silent nod from that porch was now recast in a sinister, unbearable light. For Linda and David Parker, now in their 70s, the news was the final, brutal climax of a 32-year ordeal. There was a measure of relief, an end to the torturous, soul-eroding state of not knowing. The endless, looping questions that had haunted their every waking moment for 3 decades finally had answers. But the relief was engulfed by a fresh wave of profound, unimaginable grief. The uncertainty that had defined their lives was now replaced by a brutal, horrifying certainty. They knew the horrific details of their children's final days, the fear, the cold, the neglect, the end of hope. Even a hope that had long since faded to a near imperceptible ember was a death in itself. David, whose health had declined significantly during the long years of searching, found a small measure of peace in the finality. But for Linda, the knowledge of her children's suffering was a new and terrible burden. The confession had provided an answer, but it had not brought their children home. The hope of giving Jessica and Tommy a proper burial, of bringing them back to the consecrated ground of the church they never reached, remained unfulfilled, a final, aching wound that would never be allowed to heal. The truth, when it finally arrived after 32 years of agonizing silence, was not a cleansing fire, but a corrosive acid. It did not heal the wounds of Cedar Falls. Instead, it redefined them, burning away the thick, protective scar tissue of uncertainty to expose the raw, agonizing nerve of a known horror. The community, which had for decades grieved for 2 lost children as a tragic mystery, now had to grapple with a far more intimate and sickening reality. They had grieved alongside the family of the monster who took them. The collapse was not one of bricks and mortar, but of memory itself. The entire history of the town's peaceful, idyllic past was now forced through a dark new filter. At the local diner, conversations that once flowed easily now fell into hushed, uncomfortable silences when the Kowalski name was mentioned. Residents pulled out old yearbooks and family photo albums from the 1990s, once viewed with sweet nostalgia, now examined with a sense of creeping dread, searching the backgrounds of smiling faces, wondering what horrors were unfolding just beyond the frame. The town square, the school playground, the very streets themselves were now overlaid with a ghostly blueprint of a predator's hunting ground. Elm Street, once a symbol of childhood freedom and neighborhood safety, became a place of somber pilgrimage. People would drive down it slowly, their gazes lingering on the stretch of sidewalk between the Parker house and the corner, trying to comprehend how a portal to such darkness could have opened on such an ordinary patch of pavement. The past had been irrevocably rewritten, and its new, grim author was Frank Kowalski. In the wake of this revelation, the lives of Linda and David Parker were fundamentally, seismically reshaped for 3 decades. Their grief had been an active, searching, fighting entity. David's basement, with its elaborate charts, maps, and timelines, had been the war room for his obsessive hunt for a faceless phantom. With Kowalski's confession, that long war was over. The phantom now had a name and a face, and the hunt was finished. In a slow, painful, and deeply cathartic process that took several weeks, David began to dismantle his investigation. He took down the faded newspaper clippings, their edges yellow and brittle. He carefully removed the pins from the maps that traced a web of false leads and dead ends across the country. He packed away 30 years of pain into cardboard boxes, transcripts, witness statements, letters from psychics and well-meaning strangers, an act of final, sorrowful surrender. But peace did not follow. His obsessive search for who had simply transformed into an agonizing, helpless, and eternal search for where. Linda, who had channeled her unimaginable pain into community advocacy, found her work imbued with a new tragic weight. Standing at a podium at a conference for families of the missing just months after the confession. Her voice was steady, but her message had changed. She no longer spoke with the faint glimmer of hope she once tried to offer, but with the somber, hard-won wisdom of someone who had traveled to the end of that dark road and knew the terrible truths that could wait there. "We live with uncertainty," she told the silent, listening crowd, "because sometimes the certainty is a hell of its own. But we must demand the truth, no matter its cost, because it is the only thing that is truly ours." Their pain, once a vast and open question mark, had solidified into a declarative, brutal, and unending sentence. The memorial garden at St. Matthew's Lutheran Church, created years ago in a spirit of hopeful remembrance, also underwent a quiet transformation. The two small angel statues among the carefully tended flowers were no longer just traditious symbols of the lost. They were now confirmed cenotaphs for the dead. The first annual prayer service on October 13th after the news broke was unlike any that had come before. The atmosphere was heavy, thick with a shared, silent understanding. The prayers were no longer pleas for a safe return, but solemn requiems for two souls whose fate was finally, horribly, known. The community, shattered and redefined, began the long, painful process of learning how to live with the certainty of what they had lost, and, more disturbingly, what had lived silently, invisibly, among them, just when it seemed that all the secrets had been unearthed, that the story had reached its final, tragic equilibrium. The past offered one last, haunting, and profoundly beautiful whisper. In the spring of 2024, the congregation at St. Matthew's, in an act of moving forward, decided to update the church's aging heating system. The work required demolition in the deep, forgotten corners of the church basement, areas of cold stone and cobwebs that hadn't been thoroughly examined in decades. As two workers, their conversation mundane, their minds on lunch, dismantled an old defunct furnace. One of them felt his crowbar hit a section of the wall that sounded hollow. It was a structural anomaly, out of place. Curiosity piqued. They carefully chipped away at the plaster, the sound of their tools echoing in the cold, subterranean quiet. Behind it, they found not pipes or wiring, but a hidden compartment, sealed with a precision that was both skillful and sinister, eerily similar in its construction to the one discovered at the depot. Inside, wrapped carefully in protective plastic against the damp and the ravages of time, were two small church hymnals. The moment the police were called and Captain Morrison, now a civilian consultant, arrived, a reverent hush fell over the scene. On the inside covers, written in the careful, looping script of childhood, were the names Jessica Parker and Tommy Parker. The books were time capsules of a lost innocence. Tucked inside the pages were pressed autumn flowers. The colors faded, but their forms still perfect. And small, simple drawings the children had likely made during long sermons, a house with a chimney puffing out smoke, a smiling sun, a stick-figure family holding hands. But it was a small folded note, tucked between the pages of Jessica's hymnal, that delivered the story's final, devastating, and ultimately redemptive emotional climax. Morrison himself drove the artifacts to the Parker home. The moment he presented the hymnals to Linda and David was one suspended in time, thick with the weight of 32 unspoken years. David stared at his son's name, his hand covering his mouth as a silent sob shook his aging frame. Linda's trembling fingers, wrinkled with age and sorrow, gently opened her daughter's book and traced the letters of her name, a tangible connection across an impossible gulf of time. She unfolded the note. The note, confirmed by analysis to be in her own 8-year-old hand, read, "We are scared, but we are together. We love mommy and daddy. Jesus will take care of us." In those few, simple words, an entire universe of meaning resided. It was an acknowledgement of their terror, a testament to their love for each other, and a profound declaration of their unshakable childhood faith. The discovery raised a host of new, unanswerable questions. The prevailing theory among investigators was that Kowalski, a creature of hubris and psychological games, had used his access as a handyman in the weeks following the abduction to hide the books in the church. It was a twisted trophy, a final, secret act of violation, hiding a piece of his crime in the one place the community looked to for comfort and sanctuary. But whatever the killer's profane motive might have been, the note itself was sacred. A message in a bottle cast into an ocean of time had finally, miraculously, washed ashore. It was not a clue to the crime, but an answer to a deeper question, a testament to a little girl's profound love in the face of unimaginable terror. It was her final, indelible legacy. What then is the true nature of justice? Is it found in a courtroom, with a guilty verdict and a prison sentence that satisfies the public's demand for retribution? Frank Kowalski escaped that. Is it found in a confession, in the cold, hard facts of a crime finally laid bare for all to see? For the Parker family, those facts brought as much pain as they did peace. A brutal certainty that closed one door only to open another one filled with horrific images. Or perhaps justice is something more resilient, something more personal, something that can endure even when all else is lost. Perhaps it's found in the unwavering dedication of a detective who never closed the file, who carried the ghosts of 2 children with him for his entire career. Perhaps it is found into the relentless hope of parents who never stopped searching, and in the quiet, steadfast loyalty of a community that never truly forgot. The story of Jessica and Tommy Parker became a landmark in the study of cold case investigations. Captain Morrison, in his full retirement, often spoke at law enforcement conferences, using the Parker case as a powerful lesson on the vital importance of perseverance, interagency cooperation, and the power of new technology to give a voice to the past. The case served as an enduring, tragic warning to countless small towns across America that the greatest dangers are often not the ones that come from the outside, but the ones that grow silently, patiently from within, hidden behind a familiar face and a neighborly wave. In the end, the final act of the story was not one of legal retribution, but of sacred remembrance. At a special memorial service, the pews of St. Matthew's filled with the faces of those who had searched as teenagers and now attended with their own children. A testament to the generations touched by the tragedy. Reverend Matthews, now elderly and retired, returned to the pulpit one last time. The 2 small hymnals, precious relics of 2 lost lives, were returned to the church. Linda Parker, her voice trembling but clear, stood before the congregation that had shared her journey for over 3 decades and spoke of the long, dark road from 1991 to the bittersweet closure of 2024. The hymnals were then placed in a permanent, climate-controlled memorial case in the church sanctuary. They remain there today, a tangible link to the lost children, a symbol of a love that proved stronger than fear, and a faith that could shine in the very darkest of places. The brutal truth of what happened to Jessica and Tommy Parker changed their community forever, but the echo of their final, whispered message of love and togetherness, finally heard after 32 years of silence, is what truly and powerfully endures.